In Silicon Valley, one commandment was written in stone. To rule the world, you must invent the future. Engineers believed that pure innovation was the only path to glory. Yet the company that sits on the throne today mocked this sacred rule. They didn't invent the engine of the digital age. They simply bought it, repackaged it, and sold it to a desperate giant. Let's rewind to 1980. IBM, known as Big Blue, was more than a corporation. It was an empire. They controlled the mainframe market with an iron fist. But a fissure had appeared in their fortress. A group of kids in a garage, calling themselves Apple, had released a toy called the personal computer. The world was paying attention, and the giant grew anxious. IBM needed to strike back, and they needed to do it fast. Usually it took them 5 years to launch a product. They didn't have 5 years. So the executives made a decision that seemed logical then, but fatal now. They shattered their golden rule of vertical integration. We don't need to build everything, they said. Let's buy the parts and assemble them. They outsourced the chips to Intel and the printers to Epson. They cared only about the hardware, believing the machine itself was the king and software was merely a servant. In their haste to crush Apple, they threw their gates wide open. And through those gates walked a young Bill Gates, ready to exploit the greatest oversight in business history. The giant was looking for a supplier, but they were about to invite in their conqueror. When the IBM executives sat down with Microsoft, they thought they were talking to a junior partner. They asked for programming languages, but then dropped the bombshell. We also need an operating system. At that precise moment, Microsoft had nothing. No code, no team, no prototype. A standard engineer would have said, "Sorry, we can't do that." But Bill Gates wasn't just an engineer. He was a shark. Without blinking, he looked the giant in the eye and said, "We can do it." It was a bluff of epic proportions. He had promised to sell the soul of a machine he didn't own. The clock started ticking. Failure meant exposing Microsoft as frauds. But Gates didn't run to a computer terminal to start coding. He ran to the market. He knew that somewhere in Seattle, someone else had already done the work. His radar locked on to a small outfit called Seattle Computer Products. A programmer there, Tim Patterson, had written a rough, functional program to test their hardware. He called it QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System. The name said it all. It wasn't elegant. It was a knockoff of an existing system, built in just 4 months. But to Gates, this dirty code was gold. Microsoft approached Patterson with a poker face that would make a gambler sweat. They kept the existence of the IBM deal a total secret. If Patterson had known his code was destined for the world's biggest computer company, he could have named any price. Instead, kept in the dark, he sold it for a flat fee of $50,000. Gates bought the rights, polished the dirty code, and slapped a new label on it, MS-DOS. He had just secured the crown jewel of the PC era for the price of a luxury car, and the original creator never saw it coming. The negotiation room was quiet, but the air was thick with tension. On one side sat IBM's legal team, confident and imposing. On the other sat Bill Gates and his young team. This meeting would decide the fate of the technology world, yet the two sides were fighting completely different battles. IBM's focus was singular, hardware. They wanted to keep the cost of the operating system low to maximize the profit on every physical machine they sold. They pushed a contract across the table. "We'll pay you a development fee," they said, "but we want the royalty rates kept low." It was a classic squeeze. They treated Microsoft like a vendor supplying screws or cardboard boxes. Any other businessman would have fought for more money up front. But Bill Gates did something that baffled them. He agreed immediately to their price. Then he made his move. Calmly, he pointed to a clause and requested a change. He didn't ask for more money. He asked for rights. Microsoft will retain the ownership of MS-DOS, he proposed, and we reserve the right to license it to other companies. The IBM executives exchanged glances. They barely suppressed their smirks. In their minds, the request was laughable. They thought, we are IBM. We are the market. Who in their right mind would buy this software if it's not running on an IBM computer? To them, the software was useless without their hardware. Blinded by their own arrogance, they believed they were giving Gates a worthless concession. They shrugged and signed the paper. That signature was the sound of a trap snapping shut. It was a Trojan horse. Gates knew what IBM didn't, that IBM was about to set a standard that the rest of the world would copy. By keeping the right to sell the software to others, he ensured that every copycat, every rival, and every future computer maker would have to pay a tax to Microsoft. IBM walked out of that room thinking they had secured a cheap vendor. In reality, they had just handed over the keys to the kingdom. The IBM PC hit the shelves, and it was an instant revolution. Time magazine named the computer its Machine of the Year, and IBM celebrated their victory. But the champagne had barely dried when the trap sprung. IBM's strategy of using off-the-shelf parts meant that the hardware was easy to copy. And copy they did. A wave of hungry competitors, led by companies like Compaq and Dell, descended on the market. They built clones, machines that worked exactly like IBM's, but were faster and cheaper. But these metal boxes were useless without a brain. The clone makers couldn't ask their rival IBM for the operating system, so they all lined up at Bill Gates's door. Thanks to that non-exclusive license, Gates held the keys. He sold MS-DOS to every single one of IBM's competitors. The market was flooded with cheap PCs, and IBM's market share began to plummet. But for Microsoft, it didn't matter who sold the computer. Whether a customer bought an IBM, a Compaq, or a Dell, the money for the operating system flowed into Bill Gates's pocket. The hierarchy of the tech world flipped upside down. Hardware became a commodity, a brutal race to the bottom with razor-thin margins. But software became a monopoly. IBM had effectively funded the creation of the very weapon that would destroy its dominance. By the time the dust settled, the giant was left fighting a price war it couldn't win, while Microsoft had become the invisible tax collector of the digital age. The paradox was complete. The company that started with nothing, bought a product for $50,000, and created virtually zero original technology, ended up owning the world. They proved that in the game of empires, it's not about who builds the castle, it's about who owns the ground it stands on.